In this video, we'll look at how to use Quota Management API to see the current quota and to request increases in quota for certain resource types in Azure. So if we look at the portal under subscriptions, and then we look at a given subscription, under usage and quotas in the portal, we can see this screen that shows for a given region, how many quotas of a certain VM types my subscription has. So you can see 20 here, and then you can also see if it's adjustable or not by a support ticket. And if I click on, for example, DB5 VMs in East US 2 region, let's say in East US region, for my subscription, I can see, and I can make a request to increase this quota. So if I submit a request for, let's say 21 instead of 20, if I submit this request, it will either process the request, or with a new validation that you might have not yet seen, it looks like it's brand new, is requesting additional quota requires multi-factor authentication for the user. And because my user is not enabled, it's not allowing me to perform this request. So this is something relatively new that you might have not seen. Okay, but I could request the increase. And once that increase is requested, if it's possible to process it automatically, it will process it. And if it's not, it will tell me to open a support ticket. And you can actually see the message about the quota requests will soon require multi-factor authentication to prevent abuse. So this is relatively new, this part. Okay, what's also new is that there is going to be this new UI for Azure Quota Management that kind of allows me to select different subscriptions and look at them separately from one screen and see all of my quotas, download it, and look at things across the board, right? So this is all good and convenient for manual quota requests. However, what if I want to make these requests automatic, if they can be approved automatically, to be processed automatically? But obviously if they cannot be approved automatically, I would still need to open a support ticket. So what do we have for that? So if we look back in February of 2021, there was a blog post from the Quota team describing this new API for Quota REST API, and this blog post describes the Quota REST API and links to it and talks about it. And then there's actually also a relevant, I'll put the links to these, relevant article back from last year, from 2021, March, talking about how to use the Quota API for managing certain things. And if we visit this API in the documentation, we'll find it right here. Right, it's described. It sits in that time. That API sits under the reserved VM instances. Funny enough, and then under Quota API is where it is, and you can see that it's using what's called Microsoft.Capacity namespace, and that's where which corresponds to their capacity reservations and also reserved instances, but that's where the quota was. And a quota was there, and it was supporting operations for things like virtual machines, like you can see it right here, vCPU quota, and Azure Machine Learning quota. However, what I noticed is that recently there was this announcement from Azure team this is recent, so right now we are in December 2022. About a month ago, in November, there was a release public preview of Quota API to manage more quotas. And I was a little bit confused by this announcement because this Quota API from before was already in GA for a while. So we can see from last year, it's generally available. So what is this exactly that we are talking about here? And when looking, and interestingly, this links back to the same page we just were on, so this link may need to be updated. But the announcement talked about additional things. You can, first of all, it says that it's preview, and it's talking about ability to manage quotas for virtual machines like we could before, for networking, for vCPU caches, and preview services. So what is that? And really what it is talking about is in this page of the generally available quota, we see this note, okay? Took me a little while to understand, but this note is saying that there is now a new version of Quota REST API, and it's documented in this location. It uses the Quota namespace to support and supports virtual machines, networking, and Azure Preview Service. So what I wanted to do in this video is kind of show both of these APIs real quickly, how to use them and how they look. And I think probably since this is a brand new API, even though it's in preview, it's probably the future looking version where the other resource types will support their quota. So let's take a look where this link takes us. This link takes us to this Azure Quota API. So what's the difference? First of all, we can see that it's sitting under quota instead of capacity, right? So over here it says quota, and in that one, it says reserved instances, right? So that's number one. So it has its own namespace. It is in public preview. So this is what this announcement is talking about, is actually this API. It supports public AP, public preview for ability to request increases for these various things. And it needs to be using Microsoft Quota resource provider namespace. It has similar throttling, it has similar errors. I can even notice that here in some cases it still has references to the old namespace, but that doesn't matter. And there's some API wrappers inside of SDKs. So these are the two types of APIs. And what we're going to do next is I'll open Postman. And in the Postman, we will take a look at making requests to these APIs. So now that we know the two APIs, these two blog posts from 2021 refer to the previous one, and this is the new one. Great. So now let's explore both of these APIs. So first we need to be able to authenticate, right? So first of all, try to use my user, the logged in user, and we'll make some REST calls to these API endpoints. Right here are the API endpoints under quota. We can get, create, list, update, etc. We know that we will need quota request operator role. And if you look at this role in the documentation, quota request operator, in the documentation, it seems to list still the capacity endpoint right here and some additional requests, and we'll see if that is true. And so let me get an access token for my currently logged in user. So I'll just run this command, get access token. Obviously, this token will expire, so it's not a big deal that I'm showing it right now. I'll copy this token. Okay, just to make it super clear where I got it. So basically, this is just from my logged in user token. And I'm going to open Postman. And Postman, I have these two folders I made, one for the old API, the existing Microsoft Capacity one, and one for the new API. We'll take a look at both of them. Then I have an environment created, and inside of this environment, I'll set this access token variable, okay, and save the environment. Great. So let's see what we get. So if I do a quota list call using the Microsoft Capacity, you can see I'm passing my subscription ID, I'm passing the access token, the bearer token authorization, and there is the URL endpoint. That's the most interesting part, is that's what it looks like, right? So I'm going to tell it, hey, Microsoft Capacity, resource providers, Microsoft Compute, location, in the location in question. I think it's West US 3 that I set in a variable right now, service limits. Where do I get this endpoint from? It is basically from the API documentation of the Microsoft provider, right? Capacity, and that's the provider URL and location service limits, right? So let's make this call and see what we get. So I receive a response, and this response lists to me the APIs. So it shows me the family. For example, you can see right here, standard A0 through A7 family of VMs, and it shows me my current limit is 20, and I'm currently using nothing. And this is basically how it works. And there are some other calls I can make. So let's say specifically for the S5 family, I pick that name from the response and it shows it to me. And this again, location is Southeast Asia right now for me from my environment. Okay. What I can also do is I can create a request. And to create a request, I make a put call and I provide the properties of which family I want to increase to what in which location, right, for VMs. So let's actually pick another location potentially. So we'll just change in my environment for, oh, let's just do West US, save, and this will now be West US and make a call and let's create, we want 21 VM cores of this family in that location. We'll make a request and we're going to get an error. And the same error we saw in the portal, it's a relatively new error. Before it wasn't there. It says MFA required because I cannot call this API with a user that does not have MFA required and I don't have MFA enabled on my user. So what do you do if you need automation? You cannot have multi-factor authentication for your automation. So for that, what I did, and this is what you would want to do, is I created a service principal. Just going to show you. Right here, I created service principal. I gave it a password. Under secrets, I created a password. And then I granted this access control to this service principal. I basically added a role assignment. And I'll just show you which one. I looked at quota request operator and I was worried that, hey, maybe it does not contain the relevant things I need. But if I look at the view of the quota, you can see it actually includes both the Microsoft Capacity, the previous API, the one we are right now trying, and then the new one as well, even though the documentation doesn't yet contain the example of that, but that's what's already there. So I granted this permission to my AV quota. So it's a quota operator. And now using Postman call, I can do a token client credential grant. I'm going to grab this access token that represents my service principal instead of my user. And I'm going to set that on my Postman environment and save this. And if I make a call now, this call went through because it's not a user, it's a service principal. So I'm a fake check. Does not make sense for it, and it works. And it told me, hey, I created a capacity request, and this is the capacity request identifier or name, and it's location specific, and it says it's in progress right now. Okay, so what can I do? I can check the progress. And again, for now, we're still looking at this previous Microsoft Capacity API, so I can do a get request. And if I put here my request ID, it says to me that it's still processing my request. This may take a while, right? So I could poll this for the period of time that it is processing. And I can see that basically it's right now, obviously you need to be careful about hitting request limits. You don't want to call this polling it too frequently, but basically this is the URL that it says to poll for it, right? The operation status, we can just glance at that as well. It's missing their token, so let's add it. Right. And that permission, it looks like is not there for my identity. But in any case, I can pull it through the service limit requests, and I can see it's still in progress. Okay, it's still processing. Or I can list all of my requests. So these are the requests. And if I put another location here, for example, I know earlier I made a request in Southeast Asia, and it's still processing. So some of these requests may take time. They don't complete necessarily very quickly, and there could be various errors that we receive when we use these requests. So they're not always going to succeed. They may respond back with various errors. Contact support, or so we'll still need to open a support ticket. It may come up with other errors. The reason, what I also did not show is before you make this request to this capacity, Microsoft.Capacity request, you need to register that provider. This provider is registered for my subscription, therefore the calls worked, but if not, it would say provider is not registered. Before. So basically, that's how the old API works. And I guess the key part to that old API is to see that it returns the current value, meaning how much is used, and a limit, and it includes some of these, resources like compute and basically in machine learning. What if we wanted to manage quota for things like public IP addresses or other things, which this API does not support? That is where the new Microsoft Quota API namespace comes in. So let's close out all of these windows related to the previous API and look at the new one. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is we need to register the Microsoft um, Quota namespace provider. I already did it for my subscription. And then the API description is here. We have quota, we have quota operation, which is kind of the status of it, request, and usage. So it will split the quota and the usage, and the quota will support not just compute. So let's take a look at the list quota API call and see how that looks. We provide the scope, and then at the end of the scope, we provide the quotas. And the scope can be the things that this API will support in the future, such as a batch account or compute or networking. And the examples in the documentation right now has list for compute, for networking, for machine learning. We'll take a look at these two. Okay. And this is what this announcement is talking about. So let's take a look. So quota list VM, right? So I constructed the URL, and the URL is, hey, for this subscription, then I put the VMs, right? This is the provider for compute. And then I put the extension here to list the specific quotas, right? Right now it's pointing to the standard VM family. We'll remove this. So let's take this away and let's mistype this. Instead of quotas, let's say quota. And this is the API version. Okay, so let's see, where did I get the API version? I got the API version from the documentation of this API right now. It's 21.305.15. Okay, so let's take a look at what this call will do. So I'm going to, again, on purpose, change this. And you can see this API will return an error. I changed it from quotas to quota. And it's because this part of the URL thinks it's compute, this API version gets confused and it's thinking I'm trying to call the compute API because I mistyped the call. If I change this to quotas, now response will work. And if I want to just show you, if I change the API version incorrectly, you can see that for the quota API, the only version supported is this one. Okay, so let's fix it. So what do we get back? We get back a pretty big list And you can see that this list includes all kinds of compute quota, right? For example, availability set quota, total regional CPUs, virtual machine scale sets, how many we can have, dedicated vCPUs, how many we can have, cloud services, how many we can have, and then it goes into the families of the VMs right here. Okay, but what we also notice that doesn't include the current usage here. Does include the current usage. It also includes this indicator called is quota applicable, false or true. So what this is talking about, from what I understand, is in the documentation, let's find it here, is quota applicable towards the very end, states that the quota can be requested for this resource. True or false? If it's false, it means we cannot use the API to request quota for this resource. And if it's true, we can. And with the same thing can be viewed under, similar. It's similar to this yes or no, increasable yes or no in the portal, right? Adjustable yes or no. So that's what this API value means. And then if we put in here quotas standard DV5 family. Let's mistype it on purpose and see. It will say it's not a valid resource, but if I put it correctly, it will return to me my current quota, okay, for this resource in the given region, okay, in West US. This is the put quota request. So very similar. Again, I make a put request to the specific family that I need, and I put in how many CPUs I need. So I'm going to say 21. I'm going to say submit. This request will go in progress. It will give me an ID, and I can use this ID to list, all of my requests that are currently processing. So that's the one I submitted in this region, and obviously I can get it specifically by its name, just for that request. Okay, and it's still processing. Again, this processing can take time. Okay, and then what I can also see is if I change the provider from compute to network locations, because this provider is also supported, the network provider, and submit, I can see all of the different limits that exist for network, like for example, number of virtual networks, and it's not adjustable by the API. I need to open a ticket, for example. But then if I look for things that are adjustable, there will be there. For example, public IPs. You can see public IP addresses, static public IP addresses that I can request. So basically, these are the limits, and I could submit requests for increasing those limits. And in the Microsoft.Capacity API, for example, I could not submit requests for public APIs. But how do I know what's actually in use? So there is a separate API resource type here called usages instead of quotas. And if I make requests to usages, I can see how many of the quota that I have, how much is being used. Then I can see the same thing for the network, for example. So you can see this is my network usages for that resource. And so it kind of splits it. In the new API, the usages are split from the actual quota. And this is approximately all there is to this API. One thing to be aware of is when we're submitting a request. So let's submit another request. I just submitted for 21 cores. Let's submit for 22 cores. It says in progress, right? And we can see two requests are in progress now, right? One for 21, one for 22. Let's submit for 23 cores. We're gonna get a throttling. So please retry after 36 seconds, and we can see this is going to be a retry after headers also. So it says try only in an hour. So what happened here? Well, this API, both new and old, will have limits, okay? And these limits related to how many times it can be called, uh, based on my experimentation, looks like these limits are approximately, so over here it says throttling, every subscription level will be throttled, and it looks like it's about 2 or 3 times per hour for a given VM size and a given region. So if I try for DS4 family, this request will still succeed. This may not, I need to change to make sure it matches. And it says not allowed, so it's based on the location, not just the family. So let's see. Okay, so I could submit for a different family in the same location. 1, 2, third time will fail. But then if the location is different, so we can try, let's say, East US2. So for each location and each VM size, I can submit at most 2 requests an hour. Third request will time out, will be throttled. So this is approximately how these two APIs work and the differences between them. This is the GA API for VMs. The new API supports VMs, but also supports additional resource types like network, public APs, and both of them have similar limits. Both of them have the MFA requirement. The structure of the URL is very different. In one, the resource provider goes first, and then the resource for which I'm requesting, and then the other one is just the opposite. I put the resource for which I'm requesting, and then the quotas or the usages. Um, and that's about it. And the main thing to keep in mind is that not every request will be automatically approvable. Depends on subscription type, depends on capacity in the region, and it may take us some time to get these requests, the request processed, in particular for free subscriptions like mine is. And therefore, the tickets may still need to be created for the cases where automation did not work. Hopefully, this was helpful to understand what this new API is and how it is different from the previous API and how to use it. Thank you.